Chapter 13. The Meaning of the Mass. Sometimes I think that those who have never been deprived of an opportunity to say or hear Mass do not really appreciate what a treasure the Mass is. I know in any event what it came to mean to me and the other priests I met in the Soviet Union. I know the sacrifices we made and the risks we ran in order just to have a chance to say or hear Mass. When we were constantly hungry in the camps, when the food we got each day was just barely enough to keep us going, I have seen priests pass up breakfast and work at hard labor on an empty stomach until noon in order to keep the Eucharistic fast, because the noon break at the work site was the time we could best get together for a hidden Mass. I did that often myself, and sometimes when the guards were observing us too closely and we couldn't risk saying Mass at the work site, the crusts of bread I had put in my pocket at breakfast remained there uneaten until I could get back to the camp and say Mass at night. Or again, during the long Arctic summer when the work days were the longest and our hours of sleep were at a minimum, I had seen priests and prisoners deprive their bodies of needed sleep in order to get up before the rising bell for a secret Mass in a quiet barracks, while everyone else clung to those precious extra moments of sleep. In some ways, we led a catacomb existence with our Masses. We would be severely punished if we were discovered saying Mass, and there were always informers. But the Mass to us was always worth the danger and the sacrifice. We treasured it. We looked forward to it. We would do almost anything in order to say or attend a Mass. When I had been in Rome at the Russian college, dreaming of a chance to reach the Soviet Union, I had often wondered what I would do if I could not say Mass. Sometimes, as students, we talked about it. Rome, with its catacombs, probably served as inspiration for some of those conversations, but our speculations surely were somewhat romantic. We attended Mass every day at the Roman college, as we had done every day of our lives at the seminary and in our Jesuit houses. We prepared ourselves for ordination to say Mass in both the Oriental Rite and the Latin Rite. The Mass had a special meaning for us as future priests, but I suppose it would be true to say that we still took it for granted somehow. Not that it became just another religious ceremony. For me at least, the Mass always had a special meaning as a time of particular intimacy with our Lord each day. But it was so easy to attend Mass each day. It was always there, a part of the daily order, and the thought that it might someday be difficult to be able to say Mass was really only a daydream. It was something you talked about, something you read about in the history of the church persecutions, but not really something you had ever had to suffer or experience. I remember the thrill of my first Mass after the day of ordination, the privilege of performing with my own two hands the reenactment of Calvary, the joy at the thought that I had been chosen from among men for the things that were of God, and could at last fulfill the command Christ gave his disciples at the Last Supper, "Do this in memory of me." From the day of ordination, through the quiet years of Albertine, and the turmoil and upheaval that followed the Soviet takeover of Poland, there was never a day that did not begin for me with the sacrifice of the Mass. It was only when Father Victor and I began the long train ride from Lvov to the lumber camps of the Ural Mountains that our once idle daydreams about not being able to say Mass became a reality. It was only then that I first experienced the very real sense of deprivation at not being able to begin the day by celebrating the Eucharist. We carried with us bread and wine and a little Mass kit with a chalice and missal so we could say Mass. But no one in the boxcar full of workers knew we were priests, and in the crowded conditions of the car we found it very difficult to say Mass. We did the best we could. At every opportunity, particularly at stops along the way when we would leave the boxcars to stretch our legs and forage for extra food, we seized our chance to celebrate the Eucharist together. When we reached the lumber camps and found ourselves forced with barracks life in the primitive, rough-hewn quarters of the camps, we found it equally difficult to say Mass. We were afraid to risk exposure. We did not know how we would be accepted as priests, and at least in the beginning, we would only celebrate Mass when we were alone together. If we waited until we could go off into a quiet corner of the barracks during the evening, it meant that we must fast all day and still do a full day's work with the lumber gangs. Yet the barracks would be in a turmoil each morning as everyone prepared for work. It was hard to find the time then for the recollection we desired in order to celebrate the Mass as we wanted. Accordingly, we did not manage to say Mass every day, but we kept a supply of consecrated hosts so we could at least go to communion every day. The danger and the difficulty of saying Mass became a reality for us in the lumber camps of the Urals. We began then to do what we probably should have done before. We began to prepare ourselves to say the Mass by heart. We were afraid we would lose our Mass kit, the chalice or the missal, but we were determined that as long as we had bread and wine, we would try to say Mass somehow. Over and over again in the evenings when others were chatting or reading or playing cards, we would repeat to each other the prayers of the Mass until we had learned them by heart. How often in the years that followed, I thanked God for this interlude in the lumber camps of the Urals and the time of training and of grace that was given to me to prepare for the years ahead. After a few months, when Father Victor and I had adjusted somewhat to barracks existence as a way of life, we were able to find more and more occasions to say Mass. We would walk out together, for example, into the forest, and there offer Mass on a stump of a tree. I could not help thinking how the forest sometimes resembled a cathedral, the tall rows of towering trees arching over us, the hushed silence, the natural beauty around us, the silent whiteness of the snow in winter. Even time seemed to stand still as we offered the eternal sacrifice of Calvary for the many intentions that filled our thoughts and our hearts, not the least of which was the thought of the deprived thousands of the Church of silence here in this once Christian land, for whom we had come to work as priests in secret. I shall never forget, as long as I am a priest, those Masses in the forests of the Urals. At other times, Father Victor and I would say Mass sitting on the edge of our beds across from each other. We pretended to be reading or talking softly as we said the Mass prayers. We could not use the chalice in the barracks, so our cup became a common drinking glass and our host a piece of leavened bread. If people stopped to chat, we tried to break off conversation as pleasantly and as quickly as we could, and so recapture our recollection and continue our secret Eucharist. I worked outside with the lumber gangs, but Father Victor worked as an accountant in the company offices, so he always kept the Blessed Sacrament wrapped in a purificator inside his wallet in the pocket of his coat. That way we could at least receive communion each day if Mass became impossible. And later on, after we had made friends with the scrub woman who took care of the barracks, we would sometimes leave the Blessed Sacrament carefully hidden in a bundle of clothes in her little private office and living room. She was a Catholic, as we came to know, and she helped us in many ways. It was one of her greatest joys to have the Blessed Sacrament in her room and to know that the Lord she worshipped dwelt under her roof. You cannot explain all this, I know, to those who do not believe. Even for many Christians, I fear the notion of the Blessed Sacrament as the bread of life is somehow only a poetic or symbolic phrase used by Jesus in the Gospel. Yet what a source of sustenance it was to us then, how much it meant to us to have the body and blood of Christ as the food of our spiritual lives in this sacrament of love and joy. The experience was very real. You could feel its effects upon your mind and heart, upon your daily life. For us, it was a necessity to foster the life of the soul, just as much as our daily bread was necessary to sustain the body. There were so many of the exiles here in the Urals who were deprived of it and seemed indifferent. God in his own way took care of these spiritually starved people, I have no doubt, just as he was taking care of us in a special way. Who of us can fully understand the ways of God? For us, though, this bread of life, this Eucharist, was truly a source of communion with him and with those to whom we longed to bring him. The 5 long years in Lubyanka brought this home to me more forcefully than ever. I was deprived of that spiritual food and the reality of that communion. I turned to God in prayer, made frequent acts of spiritual communion throughout the day, but I literally hungered to be able to receive him once again. Every day I said from memory the prayers of the Mass, and sometimes I think these prayers served only to emphasize my sense of deprivation from the Eucharist. In those days of torment and stress, of darkness and humiliation, I knew I desperately needed the source of strength that the bread of life might have provided, and I could not have it. I prayed to God, I talked to him and asked for help and strength. I knew that he was with me. All this I had, and yet I could not have him in my hands. I could not have his sacramental presence. And the difference to me was very real. It was a hunger of the soul as real to me as the bodily hunger I constantly experienced through those years. I have often wondered in the years since whether I would have failed as badly, have come so close to despair, if I had somehow had available to me that bread of life. When I reached the prison camps of Siberia, I learned to my great joy that it was possible to say Mass daily once again. In every camp, the priests and prisoners would go to great lengths, run risks willingly, just to have the consolation of this sacrament. For those who could not get to Mass, we daily consecrated hosts and arranged for the distribution of communion to those who wished to receive. Our risk of discovery, of course, was greater in the barracks because of the lack of privacy and the presence of informers. Most often, therefore, we said our daily Mass somewhere at the work site during the noon break. Despite this added hardship, everyone observed a strict Eucharistic fast from the night before, passing up a chance for breakfast and working all morning on an empty stomach, yet no one complained. In small groups, the prisoners would shuffle into the assigned place, and there the priest would say Mass in his working clothes, unwashed, disheveled, bundled up against the cold. We said Mass in drafty storage shacks, or huddled in mud and slush in the corner of a building site foundation of an underground. The intensity of devotion of both priests and prisoners made up for everything. There were no altars, candles, bells, flowers, music, snow-white linens, stained glass, or the warmth that even the simplest parish church could offer. Yet in these primitive conditions, the Mass brought you closer to God than anyone might conceivably imagine. The realization of what was happening on the board, box, or stone used in place of an altar penetrated deep into the soul. Distractions caused by the fear of discovery, which accompanied each saying of the Mass under such conditions, took nothing away from the effect that the tiny bit of bread and few drops of consecrated wine produced upon the soul. Many a time as I folded up the handkerchief on which the body of our Lord had lain and dried the glass or tin cup used as a chalice, the feeling of having performed something tremendously valuable for the people of this godless country was overpowering. Just the thought of having celebrated Mass here, in this spot, made my journey to the Soviet Union and the sufferings I endured seem totally worthwhile and necessary. No other inspiration could have deepened my faith more, could have given me spiritual courage in greater abundance than the privilege of saying Mass for these poorest and most deprived members of Christ, the Good Shepherd's flock. I was occasionally overcome with emotion for a moment as I thought of how he had found a way to follow and to feed these lost and straying sheep in this most desolate land. So I never let a day pass without saying Mass. It was my primary concern each new day. I would go to any length, suffer any inconvenience, run any risk to make the bread of life available to these men. The bread and wine for Mass were smuggled into us by the people of nearby Arctic towns, but they generally came all the way from Ukraine. It wasn't really possible to buy Mass wine in the Siberian stores, for all the wines available there contained impurities. People who had themselves survived the camps and returned home to Ukraine, however, would send a small wooden barrel of Mass wine, about 4 quarts, to friends they had made in the towns around the camps. These friends, with the help of some sympathetic truck driver who drove in and out of the fenced and guarded prison working zones to make deliveries of construction materials, would then manage to smuggle the wine into a prisoner priest. There was, in fact, a regular traffic in smuggled goods into the camps. Vodka and foodstuffs were delivered in this way by free people in the towns who took pity on the prisoners, so it was not just Mass wine that reached us regularly. The night shift usually had a better chance of concealing the goods, for the night guards were frequently not as strict as the day guards. Only skeleton crews of prisoners worked at night as maintenance men, so the guards were fewer and security much less tight. Priests in Ukraine or Poland or Lithuania, who had not yet been arrested, or who had been released from the camps and returned home, made it a point to look after fellow priests serving terms in the camps. Nuns, too, worked marvels in helping prisoner priests. According to camp rules, a prisoner had the right to write his immediate family twice a year. Packages could also be received occasionally when permission was granted to the prisoner by the chief of security. Usually 2 packages a year were the limit. Prisoner priests, therefore, informed their relatives where they were and hinted in their letters that the priests at home be told about them and about other priests who were with them. Since priests in Ukraine and in occupied countries were under strict surveillance, though, it was generally the nuns who managed to look after the needs of deported, exiled, and imprisoned clergy. Many of them had managed to get work in local hospitals when their convents were closed, and it was they who supplied priests in the camps with Mass bread, wines, and Mass books. Pages of the books would be mixed up with newspaper and used as packing. Other pages of the Missal would be used to wrap the Mass bread. The guards paid little attention to such scrap paper in the packages, but some pages of the books would naturally be lost or thrown into the wastebasket. Prisoners who worked as janitors in the offices would be alerted, therefore, to look for and save these discarded pages before they could be burned. For a promise of a portion of the package, Hungry prisoners, whether Christians or not, were always willing to do this favor and so outwit camp authorities. Wine was a little different problem, but the nuns sent the wine, as I have said, to designated people in nearby towns. Then, in various ways and through various people, small amounts of wine were smuggled into the camp. Even at the risk of being caught and punished, faithful prisoners willingly cooperated in helping us keep a supply of mass bread and wine at various locations in the camp. As a result, every priest in the camp received what was needed to say Mass daily. If he needed something, he had only to ask, and it was provided for him if at all possible. So even in the often impossible conditions of the prison camps, a priest who let it be known that he wanted to say Mass could always do so, and we did. Within the camp, though, Mass could only be said if the greatest precautions were taken. Prisoners moved about constantly in the barracks. There were informers in every work brigade. To go to a barracks other than your own was strictly forbidden, and you'd be asked to leave the minute someone noticed that you didn't belong there. It wasn't just the guards who were so strict. The prisoners themselves took such precautions, because expert thieves were always on the lookout for a chance to steal something, anything that was better than what they had. If we got together outside the barracks, the guards became wary and suspicious of such small groups and ordered everyone to return to the barracks. Saying Mass in the camp barracks was difficult and dangerous, and we attempted it only on rare occasions or because of some urgent necessity. Then we would have to huddle together in a dark corner while friendly prisoners stood watch in the corridors to warn us of the approach of the camp guards. At their signal, we would hastily consume the species of consecrated bread and wine and quickly break up the group. Only once was I actually caught. 3 guards, obviously directed by informers, came with a few companions and made straight for us. They made us get up and stand aside while they searched. They threw the particles of consecrated bread onto the floor and under the bunks amid all kinds of rubble. The consecrated wine, though, wasn't touched, for alongside the tin cup used as a chalice, there were other tin cups standing on the stool we had been using as an altar. Every priest at some time or other during his life in camp experienced the same sad business. It was distressing, to say the least, and it made us worry about every Mass for fear of the same risk of discovery and sacrilege. Generally, therefore, we preferred to say Mass somewhere at the working site, even though it meant we had to fast all morning and then give up the few moments of rest allowed to prisoners during the luncheon break. Even then, we could not invite many people to attend the Mass, lest a daily crowd in the same place draw attention to our activities. We usually chose a shack or some corner of a foundation far from the current working areas. Sometimes it took 15 minutes or more to reach the shack or building where Mass was to be said, and we had to start on time in order not to return late to our places of work. All of this made it difficult to have many prisoners in attendance, so we would consecrate extra bread and distribute communion to the other prisoners when we could. Sometimes that meant we would only see them when we returned to the barracks at night before dinner. Yet these men would actually fast all day long and do exhausting physical labor without a bite to eat since dinner the evening before, just to be able to receive the Holy Eucharist. That was how much the sacrament meant to them in this otherwise God-forsaken place. Our rare free days, when all the prisoners were allowed to rest in camp, were the hardest of all on which to say Mass. It was the easiest time to say Mass for a large group, though, if we could get together on some pretext or other in the prison camp yard, and occasionally we did risk such a Mass, especially if the day coincided with a special religious feast or festival. But generally on such days, I would say Mass early in the morning, half lying on the bunk while most of the prisoners still slept. I would procure the wine the night before in the camp clinic or the camp disinfecting room, where friends who worked there kept the wine hidden for the priests. I held the bread in my hands, wrapped in a piece of white cloth as I lay on the bunk, and I said the prayers of the Mass by heart. Before the signal to rise was given, I would have finished my Mass on these occasions and then been able to distribute communion to others under cover of the general commotion and moving about that always followed the rising signal. Time and again I was amazed at the devotion of these men. Most of them had really had very little formal religious training. For the most part they knew little of religion except the prayers and beliefs that pious parents or grandparents had taught them, and yet they believed, and were willing to make unheard-of sacrifices for the consolation of attending Mass or receiving communion. Christian prisoners in general showed great respect for the priests in camp. Most of their free time they sought to spend in their company. Even those who did not actively practice their faith often preferred to spend time in the group around a priest. They defended and supported and encouraged the priest as much as they could. Somehow they felt an obligation in this regard. From time to time they would even offer him a portion of their own scarce ration of bread, so that he might have something extra. They wanted to make this sacrifice on his behalf, they said, in order to express their faith in God and their gratitude to him for having sent a priest into their midst. Surely the hundredfold that Christ once promised to those who left father, mother, families, and country on his behalf was here handed out, not in any spectacular way, but in the ordinary and simple actions of these generous believers through their small and continuous favors. For what they sacrificed, insignificant as it might seem, was actually a portion of all they had to survive on. And the desire for survival was uppermost in the minds of everyone in the slave camps of Siberia. To live through it all and see freedom in the end was the secret hope everyone cherished. The instinct to live, to survive, especially for those who had a family or loved ones to return to, was the strongest motivation of every hour of every day. How conscious these men were of every day they lived. They counted it both as one day less in their sentence and yet one day less in their lives. No one wished, even for his bitterest enemy, the misfortune of dying in these camps away from everything a man held dear. And yet each day, they knew, was a step in the long, slow march toward death. It was to such men as these that I had been chosen and was privileged to bring the bread of life. "Unless you eat my flesh and drink my blood," Christ said to his disciples, "you shall not have life in you. He who eats my flesh and drinks my blood shall have life and have it more abundantly." These men, with simple and direct faith, grasped this truth, and they believed in it. They could not explain it as a theologian might, but they accepted it and lived by it, and were willing to make voluntary sacrifices even in a life of almost total deprivation in order to receive this bread of life. Mass and the Blessed Sacrament were a source of great consolation to me. They were the source of my strength and joy and spiritual sustenance. But it was when I realized what the Holy Eucharist meant to these men, what sacrifices they were willing to make for it, that I felt animated, privileged, driven to make it possible for them to receive this bread of life as often as they wished. No danger, no risk, no retaliation could prevent my saying Mass each day for them. As often as you do this, do it in memory of me. Life in the labor camps was Calvary for these men in many ways every day. There was nothing I would not do to offer the sacrifice of Calvary again for them each day in the Mass.